One of the most important factors that contributed to English participation in the ruthless physical and mental slavery was this profound idea, which branded people who they enslaved as something other than human. The Negroes were to be looked at as something that was not quite an ape, but also not quite a human either. And so in the eyes of the white elite, there was a special spot right in the middle that belonged specifically to the Negro. And it was this type of thinking that allowed the enslavers to implement that version 9.0 of slavery, which was the most cruel version of slavery that has ever been practiced. And so let's talk about it, right? Let's get into it. We're going to go into this book here. It's called Race in North America by social anthropologist Dr. Audrey Smedley. And so for those who don't know what a social anthropologist is, that's someone who studies human societies and cultures and how they develop over time. And so what's involved in that study is the understanding of human behavior, social norms, group interactions, belief systems, and so forth. And so that's what makes the training that Dr. Smedley has so valuable in the examination and understanding of these slave societies. So let's turn to page 149, which one right now, and let's see what she says. Here we go. What the English were developing concurrently with slavery was a new criterion of status. The idea of race, whose rationale could be situated in the natural divisions of mankind. And so race is an idea that people believe in, and its inception stems from slavery and the European desire for domination. And so they figured out a way to classify and divide humans in such a way to make it easier for them to subdue them. And so slavery and race were developing side by side, as Dr. Smedley mentioned. And the developers looked at this as a natural division of mankind. Let's keep reading. But these divisions were not historically recognized as natural and relatively insignificant, as they were in the old world. Instead, they were compounded into autochthonous taxonomic population units and ranked so that the lowest acquired questionable human status. And black is ranked lowest in the game of racial classifications. Who was tagged black back then, and whoever is tagging themselves black today, they go down to the bottom in the eyes of any society that's following the foolish racial classification system. And what black and at the bottom meant back then in the slavery days was having a question mark next to their status of being a human. Here we go. The imposing of subhuman status within the slave context required the denial of any recognition of the human rights of the slaves. Nash portrays this phenomenon in terms of the psychological compulsion to dehumanize slaves by taking from them the rights that connoted their humanity. And what are some of the rights they took away from the enslaved that dehumanized them? Rights to protect themselves, rights of equality under the law, rights to move about freely, right? Rights to identify oneself, rights to a fair trial, right? And so on and so forth. And so why did they take these away and dehumanize them? Because this was one of the master keys for justifying their enslavement. Let's keep reading. It was far easier to rationalize the merciless exploitation of those who had been defined by law as something less than human. That something less than human is the critical element. You see that? It was critical because if it had not been done, then it would have been very difficult to get the society to back them up on this type of practice. And so labeling them as subhuman, it justified their participation in the physical slavery and also the more damaging mental slavery. And all of this happened due to the expression of human greed. Let's keep reading. The institution of slavery facilitated the dehumanization process in a logical manner by posing the contradiction that a human being is simultaneously both a piece of property, a thing, and a person. This permits emphasis on the property element and the prioritizing of the rights of owners to their property. It also allows gross subjugation and brutality on a large scale while obviating the possibility of guilt. And so it allowed the slave masters to treat people like wild animals and then still be able to sleep like a baby at nighttime. That's the trick, and that's the power of the human perception. And so people can be conditioned by others, or they can condition themselves to interpret things in such a way that may have no actual basis in reality. And so, for example, they condition the society to interpret humans with richer skin complexions as people that are less desirable. And so the richer the skin complexion, the lower place it falls on the value scale. And the people with the lighter skin complexions are supposed to be higher on the value scale. And so this is a learned interpretation of something that has no inherent or natural value, right? It's really only the value that a human provides to it that gives it meaning. But if a person really believes this interpretation, then it could provide an excuse to treat people in certain ways and not feel bad about it at all. And so the colonists, they reoriented their perception in the similar type of way. They convinced themselves that the Negro was a thing, and because they really came to believe this, this was how they were able to clear their consciousness and sleep like a baby at night. Let's continue. The dynamic tension inherent in this dilemma has always in the past provided fluid space for preserving the human rights of slaves. American slave owners, however, steeped in English legal history and traditions regarding the overarching importance of property and its connection to individual liberty, reversed this trend. They never came to accept fully the concept of slaves having natural rights that might supersede the property rights of the master. When they confronted the age-old dilemma of slavery, they chose to emphasize the slave as a piece of property first and foremost. Here we go. It was the strongest and most successful assimilation of human beings to property that has ever been made. Now, did we hear that? That's why I say that the English were no joke. People don't realize the extent that these people went to in order to craft a certain consciousness that actually viewed people as a piece of property. And so Dr. Smedley says that this was the strongest and most successful conversion of a human into a piece of property that has ever been made, right? And that's the 9.0 version of slavery that the English, who later became the white Americans, brought out, right? The advanced psychological warfare, which set them miles and miles apart from anyone else in history in this area of enslaving people. And hundreds of years later, the Negro consciousness is still fighting and struggling, trying to climb its way out of the pit so it can make the final transformation. But understand, extraordinary things have to be done in this process of climbing out of the pit. Why? Because these people, the colonizers who created the pit, they did extraordinary things that no one in history has ever done to dig this psychological grave. Understand, and let's keep reading. The evidence for this is clearest in the numerous judicial decisions that fortified property rights. It is also found in many of the laws that were enacted after the turn of the 18th century, especially the fugitive slave laws, the various legal codes controlling the movement and behavior of slaves, and the lack of specification of slave rights in any of the relevant legal documents. It is manifest unmistakably in the customs and social habits that developed governing the treatment of slaves and the interactions of slaves and masters. And that's going into the inferiority and superiority complexes that developed and manifested in the cultural habits between the slave and the master, between the black and the white, between the unfree and the free. Here we go. However, before complete assimilation could be accomplished, as Nash so clearly recognized, the slave had to be defined first as a creature who was not fully human. And when you define something, you create borders around it, which provide a distinction between what the thing being defined is and what it is not. And so, for example, this here is called a book. And we can define it as something that has a collection of written or blank pages in here that are all bound together along a single edge and are enclosed within a front and a back cover, right? And this is a book in a traditional sense. Now, if I were to reach over here and grab this pen and present this to you as a book, then what's going to happen is your unconscious mind is going to automatically signal that something is out of order. Why? Because this here, which is a pen, it doesn't fit within the boundaries of how a book is defined. And so this is one of the ways that humans use their power to define and how we recognize things that are defined. And now what the white elite Americans did was take those who they called Negroes and use their physical features of having various shades of brown skin and textured hair and use that as part of the defining of what a subhuman entity was. And so they took physical features and they linked it together with this idea of a subhuman entity. And they put them together, right? And then using science, religion, philosophy, and whatever tool that they can use, they use those to find evidence to support these ideas and to convince themselves and everyone else, including the Negro, that this here was true. And this worked out very, very well. It worked out very well because if you look long and hard enough for anything, you will eventually find something. or you'll be caught up in the illusion that you found something, right? Either one of them. But let's keep reading. There were, as we have seen, already existing tendencies in English culture that promoted and ensured this cognitive transformation and provided a kind of cultural validation for it. A hierarchical view of the world, the pseudoscientific religious notion of the great chain of being, and an extreme form of ethnocentrism emanating from the long antagonistic relationships with other neighboring groups, which we're going to find out about in a little bit. Here we go. The English had an elaborate conception of what savagery was all about, and most important was its subhuman nature. We will recall that in the late 16th century, some Englishmen were beginning to believe that the wild Irish, their prototype savages, were inherently inferior and could never become civilized. Pay attention. Paralleling the promotion of black labor as the only viable and suitable labor force that could be totally controlled in the context of colonial development, the English increasingly fitted the Africans into the mold that the Irish had once occupied in the dreams of the Sidneys, the Gilberts, the Rowleys, and like-minded others. It was fortuitous for the English that, 1, the new labor force happened to be not only culturally different, but physically distinct and not easily mistaken for any other populations in the new colonies. And 2, the African Atlantic trade provided an unlimited supply of this labor. And how was it possible for the English to get their hands on an unlimited supply of slave labor? Because the elite African kings were heavy in the business of sending people into the interiors of Africa to capture vulnerable people. And no matter how many people try to make excuses for their involvement in the slave trade, the fact of the matter is there would have been no slave trade without their involvement, right? Absolutely none. It wouldn't have worked out. And so they played a pivotal role in supplying unlimited slaves to meet the unlimited demand. And just like the English, who shared similar physical features to that of the wild Irish, and that didn't stop them from warring with them and attempting to subdue them, so it was with the various tribes on the African continent who looked similar to each other, but they still raided one another and grabbed slaves from each other, right? That didn't matter. So we shouldn't take these modern ideas of being the same people just because people share some similar physical traits and then backdate these ideas and place them into the minds of people who never had those ideas and they never thought that way, right? But let's keep reading. Several observations should be made with regard to the complexity of the processes taking place and the dynamic nature of the interplay of ideological beliefs impinging on these processes. One is that it was ironically the context of a developing Christian world that virtually required the transmutation of the Negro's human status. Christianity was a doctrinal religious movement that emphasized humanitarian and spiritual concerns over material ones. Certain sectors of Christian European society were, throughout the centuries, progressively elaborating and expanding on the themes of Christian brotherhood, human rights, and the elevation of the good of the many over the privileges of the few. And so this was one of the instances where Christianity was used as a tool for something positive, although it was limited to the Christians, right? In this instance, here we go. European Americans were virtually all exposed or conditioned at one level and to a greater or lesser degree to the virtues of selflessness, charity, compassion, and brotherly love. Within their own communities, certain standards of social behavior, shared systems of etiquette and politeness, and shared attitudes towards proper social graces all exemplified, at least minimally, the Judeo-Christian values governing human interactions. Theoretically, those who failed to adhere to the 10 Commandments and the Golden Rule to treat others as they would like to be treated would experience divine retribution, if not here on earth, then in the next world. Such a sanction was strong in a world where religious faith was still a significant aspect of a people's social well-being. And so what happened? Let's find out. But greed and the great drive to accumulate wealth, which were the engines of the new economic order, required increasing deployments of forced labor and a callous indifference to human suffering. That's what happened. Here we go. The psychological and physical violence against other human beings that is inherent in the use of forced labor called for some justification that would inhibit or assuage any guilt. For guilt was an interloper and an obstacle to the spirit of growing capitalism. Given the degradation of slavery, It took only a minor cognitive transition to focus on the obvious physical and behavioral differences between Africans and Europeans and reach the conclusion that Africans were somehow not quite human like themselves. With this conclusion, all moral and ethical problems receded, and there remained only the pragmatic ones of selective perception, namely the obliteration from one's daily experience of any consciousness of the slave's human qualities. And that's the selective use of the human mind, to use it in a way to see only what one wants to see and then ignore all the rest, right? And in this instance, searching for all the reasons to justify why the Negro could be deemed subhuman and then just ignoring all the other obvious reasons as to what would make them human, right? Let's keep going. Because the new definitions depended upon the very visible differences of the blacks, this psychological mindset had to be extended also to those free blacks whom one might encounter. And they weren't going to let the free blacks slither out of this either. And that's tying into what Governor Gooch said when he wanted to fix a perpetual brand upon the free Negroes and mulattoes, right? Who were walking around and seeing themselves just as good as the whites were, right? Let's keep going. Here we go. This accounts for their growing patterns of behavior and their corresponding attitudes, deeply humiliating and degrading, that Europeans showed to all blacks, especially in the southern English colonies. However trivial, every act symbolically had to remind both masters and slaves, whites and free blacks, of the subhuman status of the blacks. And so there was a time when the blacks could not make eye contact with whites as they walked past them. And so this was one of the symbolic acts that was used to reinforce within the society that blacks were the inferiors and the whites the superiors, right? Or the blacks the subhumans and the whites the actual humans, right? This was that 9.0 version of slavery that they developed in America, right? The making of an entire society and crafting it symbolically to represent this idea, right? In the everyday workings of the society, right? This is crafty stuff that these people did. Let's get some more. It also explains the increasing focus on the physical attributes of the Negro. This concern for the physical differences of blacks was to grow and intensify throughout the 18th century. It attracted the attention of learned people and scientists, even as it was evolving as the basis for social, political, and economic discrimination. And so there were scientists who were doing things like measuring skulls and then interpreting those findings in such a way to support the prevailing ideas. Jordan notes that there was a rapid growth of interest in the anatomical investigations of human differences in both America and Europe toward the end of the 18th century. Two things are striking about this development. We can conclude that slavery was seminal to the creation and development of the idea of race in North American colonies. First, it gave the colonists, individual and collectively, the unrestrained power to create their own savage. They fabricated and imposed their ancient imagery of savagery over an easily distinguishable and powerless category of people, making it possible to view them as subhuman. Here we go. Second, because slavery always exacerbated cultural behavioral differences between the free and the enslaved, black and white behavior grew even more divergent, especially on those plantations where slaves were forced to survive under brutish conditions. Pay attention. When people were treated like beasts, they inevitably behaved accordingly. And that's the creation of the black culture in America. The whites created an environment where the Negro consciousness had no route to move. It only had one route to go, and that's down into the pit, right? It was a product of the pit. And it's just like if you take a dog, for example, and you cage it up and you keep it there all day and then you mistreat it and do all types of treacherous things to it, then what's going to happen? The behavioral responses of fear and aggression, those are what's going to find expression through the dog, because the environment is constrained in such a way as to where those behaviors become the most suitable to match the energy of the environment, right? And this is similar to the environment that they crafted for the Negro, right? In the slave times, right? And even afterwards. They created an environment to where certain human traits would become ascendant in the Negro, right? And Negroes would then act and behave accordingly. And that behavior was appropriate to match the energy of the slave and oppressive environments, right? But that behavior, mindset, and culture wasn't suitable for anything outside of that environment. And so what happened after slavery? After making miniature copies of themselves, many of their descendants eventually found their way into the inner cities and brought the Negro consciousness with them, right? What else do we expect them to bring with them, right? It's not like the Negro consciousness was just going to magically disappear after slavery and during a certain period of time. It doesn't just go away. And so this is an area where massive amounts of work have to be put in, right, to pull that consciousness out of the pit. It went from a yes, sir, massa, I's are going to do it when I cans. That type of original Negro type of consciousness and character, right, and progressed over time, right? The intention was never to stay like that, right? That original type of Negro consciousness. It's not to keep staying like that. It's to evolve and progress over time, right? That's what you have to understand. It's to learn the lessons so that the consciousness can evolve. And so the I am that's within can become what it will become, right? And so like Dr. Smedley said, blacks and whites began to diverge, right, under the slave environment, meaning the blacks and whites started to act very different from each other. Let's keep going. The slavish, cringing behavior forced on the slaves, the stumbling and awkwardness, the inability to remember simple directions, the feigned ignorance or ill health, all were postulated as innate. And that's after the Negroes came to believe in their own inferiority. It became a self-fulfilling cycle, which the whites then described as innate or a natural part of this piece of property that they called a Negro, right? Let's keep going. This belief was then used as justification for the further indignities and brutalities of slavery. It was a cycle that more deeply embedded in the white mind the idea that behavior and biology were conjoined and inseparable. Third, slavery enabled the colonists to maintain the Negro as a separate and discrete social category, imposing laws that preserved their distinctiveness. Although some miscegenation occurred, it did not approach the degree of genetic mixture of African, European, and Indian people found elsewhere. That's referring to the Latin American colonies. Legal prohibitions against intermarriage and fornication, along with the rule of hypodescent, meant that the pigmentation and physiognomies of the original populations could be preserved intact, for the most part, and thus be utilized for the critical function of maintaining easily perceived social categories. Fourth, slavery facilitated the establishment and maintenance of unequal social rank even after emancipation. It created gross cultural differences between whites and blacks and left the latter as a largely illiterate population without property or status and ignorant of prevailing political and economic processes. You see that? This stuff was no joke, right? Nothing to be taken lightly at all. Because of its unequivocal linkage of social identity to physical characteristics, all people could easily be conditioned to such inequality. The ranking was implacable and permanent. All whites, regardless of social status, income, education, occupation, or social refinement, would always be on the top, and all the blacks at the bottom, in the pit, right? And at the very bottom of the pit. And this is how they constructed the society. And this is what America as a whole has been attempting to climb out of, or at least painting the picture that this is what they want to climb out of. Because truth be told, there are still many people who benefit from this black and white social structure, right? And it's not just the whites. Understand, there are blacks who benefit too, who understand exactly what we're talking about right now, and they still play the role of being a black person and perpetuating that to everybody else, right? They'll play the role as long as it gets them paid and in a position of power, right? And our job is to come from under that entire social structure and evolve. And this is why it's important to know the history and also to interpret it from a certain perspective. Because interpretation, this is one of the tools that the enslavers used to define the Negro as subhuman. And it's also one of the most important tools, understand, one of the most important tools in freeing the mind, all right? And so hopefully this has shed some light on the subject and have given you an extra layer of light to find your way on the path. And right now I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.